They thought she was nothing but a Jokan outsider, walking into a place where no woman was welcome. The biker bar reeked of smoke, sweat, and mockery as their leader stepped forward to put her in her place. But within minutes, the laughter died. With raw strength and unshakable calm, she pinned the man every one of them feared to the wall, and the silence that followed was louder than any roar of engines. Who was she? And why did she walk out without saying a single word? This is the story of the night no biker would ever forget. The building stood on the edge of the highway, its paint peeled to gray patches that blended into the dust of the rural road. A sagging wooden sign hung above the doorway, its neon letters half dead, buzzing faintly against the dark. From outside, the place already felt like a dare. A parking lot filled with weathered bikes stretched before it, chrome catching the dim glow of the bar's lights. The air was thick with gasoline fumes and the low, steady rumble of engines cooling after long rides. Every detail announced that this was a place marked by territory, and territory was not easily surrendered. Inside, the atmosphere was denser still. The smell hit first, smoke soaked into the wood, stale beer pooled in cracks between floorboards, sweat and leather clinging to every booth. The lights overhead buzzed in irregular rhythms, humming like insects too stubborn to die. Neon signs for brands of beer flickered over the bar, casting pale blue and red stains across the walls. A jukebox leaned crooked in the corner, its glass smeared, its speakers crackling as an old rock song droned beneath. The rise and fall of voices. The voices themselves filled the room in layers. Laughter that had the edge of cruelty, the kind that echoed louder when it was directed at someone weaker. Shouts from a pool game where men in sleeveless vests leaned over warped tables, chalking cues with restless energy. The slam of glasses on wood, the scrape of boots across the floor. It was noise meant not just to occupy the room, but to claim it. To remind anyone listening that this was their space. The walls were cluttered with reminders of the group that ruled the bar. Photographs of past rides. Men lined up in leather. Arms draped over one another's shoulders, each image radiating ownership. A flag bearing a grinning skull hung behind the bar, its fabric stained at the edges. Even the bartender wore the patch stitched into his Vesta silent uniform, marking him as one of them. Two outsiders. The bar carried a warning without needing words. The pool cue slammed on the table, a little harder when strangers walked through the door. Conversations dipped, just for a beat, whenever a face unfamiliar appeared. Women came in sometimes, but rarely alone, and almost never without someone who could vouch for them. It was not a place built for welcome. It was a place built for testing, where belonging was weighed not by kindness but by strength. The furniture carried the scars of years of those tests. Booth cushions split open, their stuffing showing like old wounds. Tables carved with knives, initials scratched into the wood beside burn marks from cigarettes pressed too deep. The floor bore faint stains no mop had ever fully erased. Each mark told a story of nights when challenges had been answered with fists, when laughter had turned sharp enough to cut. The men who filled the bar seemed part of it, as if the smoke and the walls and the floor had shaped them into what they were. Their jackets creaked when they moved, patches stitched into leather darkened with age. Rings glinted when they lifted their drinks. Tattoos crawled across their arms and up their necks. Shapes and words inked in a language outsiders weren't meant to read. They lounged in groups, spreading across the room with an ease that was more warning than relaxation. They didn't need to defend the place openly. Their silence and their smirks did it for them. Now and then, the door opened and let in a crack of night air. Each time, the noise shifted, just slightly. Heads turned, eyes weighed, whoever dared step inside. If it was one of their own, the room flowed back to its rhythm. If not, the pause stretched longer, thicker, until the newcomer either proved themselves worthy of being ignored or disappeared back into the dark. The jukebox stuttered between tracks. The pause filled by the cough of someone too long, soaked in smoke and whiskey. Glasses clinked, laughter spiked, and a pool ball cracked against another hard enough to echo across the bar. In every sound was a challenge. Can you stand this? Do you belong here? The room itself seemed to lean forward with those questions. It was more than a bar. It was a proving ground carved into wood and smoke, a place where outsiders entered at their own risk. Women especially were marked faster, judged harsher, and dismissed before their boots had even settled on the floorboards. The rules weren't written on the walls, but they didn't need to be. They lived in the way the bikers' eyes narrowed, in the smirks curling at the edges of their mouths, in the laughter that rose whenever someone dared to look out of place. This was the bar that reeked of smoke and challenge, and it was here that the night would shift, not with the slam of a cue ball or the crack of laughter, but with the steady sound of boots that belonged to someone who didn't intend to bow. The door swung inward with a groan of old hinges, cutting a line of light into the bar's heavy gloom. For a moment, the outside air slipped in cool, clean, almost foreign compared to the dense smoke that hung inside. Boots crossed the threshold, their heels striking the wooden floor with a steady rhythm that carried no apology. Heads turned. Conversations faltered. The laughter that had been buzzing at the pool tables thinned, stretching into silence as every eye shifted toward the doorway. Elena Marquez stepped inside. She was not tall, not the kind of woman who announced her presence by sheer size, but she carried herself with a composure that seemed heavier than muscle. Her frame was lean, wiry, built from years of lifting engines and tires in the dim light of a mechanic's shop. She wore no flashy colors, no armor of leather marked with patches, no uniform to shield her. Just dark jeans, scuffed boots, and a plain jacket zipped to the collar. Yet something in the way she moved, the steady gait, the eyes that scanned the room without flinching spoke of a strength that wasn't borrowed from anyone else. The room shifted around her. Pool cues paused, mid-chalk. A glass stopped halfway to a man's mouth. The jukebox played on, but even the guitar riffs seemed muted under the weight of the sudden silence. Women did come into this bar from time to time, but almost never alone. And never like this, walking straight through the door, with no hesitation. No laugh on her lips to soften her entry. The smell of smoke clung to her immediately. But she didn't wrinkle her nose, didn't flinch at the haze. She walked deeper into the room, eyes forward, her boots clicking softly against the scarred floorboards. The air carried a ripple of laughter, sharp and mocking, testing her. A man near the bar muttered something crude under his breath. Another whistled, the sound slicing through the silence like a blade. Elena kept walking. Her face was calm, but her eyes gave her away. They were sharp, unblinking, dark enough to reflect the neon glow above the bar. She wasn't there by accident, and she wasn't there for company. Each step carried the sense of someone who had already weighed the risk and accepted it. Her posture was loose, but not careless. Her hands hung at her sides, relaxed but ready, as if they knew the language of sudden motion. She stopped just inside the line of the jukebox's glow, and the room studied her, the way wolves study something unfamiliar in their territory. A woman alone was not unheard of, but a woman alone who did not shrink, who did not glance nervously at the door, who did not carry the posture of someone ready to flee, was different. The bartender's eyes flicked toward her briefly, then back to the glass he was drying with a rag. His silence spoke for him. "You're on your own here." No one would come to her defense, not in this place. From a corner booth, half shrouded in shadow, a pair of heavier eyes tracked her movement with more patience than the rest. The laughter around the room grew again, louder this time, as though daring her to break. But still, she didn't falter. Elena walked to the bar, slid onto a stool, and set her hands on the wood. The surface was sticky, etched with initials, and smelled faintly of spilt whiskey. But she didn't shift or hesitate. She sat like she belonged, though every sound in the room declared otherwise. Behind her, a man muttered to his friend, loud enough to carry. "What's she thinking? Human, in here alone." His friend snorted, the laugh jagged, but their voices only sharpened the silence around her. Elena didn't answer them. She didn't even turn. She ordered a drink with a voice steady enough to cut through the room, and in that instant, it wasn't the glass she wanted. It was the test. The woman who walked in alone wasn't looking for company. She was waiting for the challenge she knew was coming. The bartender poured her whiskey with the kind of efficiency that came from years of repetition. He didn't look her in the eyes, didn't welcome her, didn't even ask if she wanted ice. Just the dull clink of glass against wood, the amber liquid splashing halfway to the rim, and then his hand pulling back as if reluctant to linger. Elena wrapped her fingers round the glass and let it sit. She wasn't thirsty. She was listening. The sound began in fragments, low chuckles from a booth near the back, a half-snorted laugh from the pool table, a muttered comment followed by a guffaw sharp enough to cut through the jukebox hum. Then it spread. The laughter gathered in layers, rolling across the bar in waves. It wasn't light. It wasn't friendly. It had the weight of judgment, of ridicule sharpened into a weapon. "Lost, sweetheart," one voice called, dripping with sarcasm. His words carried the rhythm of a man who wanted the whole room to hear. The laughter swelled in response, feeding itself. Another voice followed, louder, closer, careful. "Boys, looks like we got ourselves a babysitter walking in here." The room answered with whistles and mocking applause, each sound aimed like a dart at her back. Alina lifted her glass slowly, not turning, not giving them her face. The whiskey burned down her throat, but she didn't cough, didn't flinch. She set the glass down with deliberate quiet, letting the laughter echo around her. She had learned long ago that silence could be sharper than retort, that sometimes the refusal to react was the loudest answer of all. But silence did not stop them. The bikers shifted closer, testing the air the way predators circle prey. A man leaned back in his chair until it creaked. His boots kicked up on the table, his smirk cutting across the distance between them. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue? Or you waitin' for one of us to teach you the rules?" The bar roared with laughter, the kind that carried no warmth, only challenge. Pool balls cracked against each other as another man slammed his cue down for emphasis, adding to the show. Elena's glass caught the neon glow, reflecting red and blue streaks across her knuckles. She didn't move. The laughter had a rhythm now, rising and falling, punctuated by crude remarks and jeers. It wasn't just noise, it was ritual. They had done this before many times. Outsiders came in, got tested, got humiliated, and either left in shame or were thrown out before they could. This was their script, their theater, and Alina was supposed to play her role. She heard the shuffle of boots behind her. A man had left his stool and wandered closer, his voice rough from cigarettes and liquor. "Don't see no patch on you. Don't see no ring on your finger, neither. Means you're nobody here." His laughter was quieter, but it was the cruelest of all. Meant only for her ears. The room watched, waiting for her to shrink, waiting for her to excuse herself, to mutter something weak, to leave. That was the way it always went. That was the way it was supposed to go. Alina finally turned her head, just enough to meet his eyes. Her gaze was steady, unblinking. She didn't smile, didn't sneer, didn't give him the satisfaction of fear. For a moment, the laughter hitched, caught in the throats of those watching too closely. Then, louder than before, it surged again, desperate to fill the pause she had created. The air in the bar thickened. The laughter had stopped being amusement. It had become a test. Every snicker, every jeer, carried the same question. "What are you doing here? What makes you think you can stand where we laugh?" Alina didn't answer yet. She let them laugh, let them show their teeth, let the room expose itself. Because she knew something none of them did that. Laughter is loudest just before it breaks. The laughter rolled on, bouncing against the smoke-stained walls. But in the farthest corner of the bar, one man hadn't joined in. He sat back in a cracked leather booth that seemed almost built for him, its shadows folding around his broad shoulders. A glass of dark liquor rested in his hand, half empty, the ice long since melted. The men around him, bikers with heavy rings and heavier stares, laughed loud enough to rattle the neon lights. But their leader remained quiet. His silence, in this place, carried more weight than the laughter of a dozen others. Jack Callahan was his name, though no one here used it. To them, he was Inkaja, a title that came not from his looks, but from the way he never let go. Once he locked onto something or someone. His jaw was square, his teeth clenched around a cigar more often than not, and his reputation stretched further than this bar, further than the cracked highways these men rode. Ironjaw was the kind of man people remembered, not because he shouted, but because he didn't have to. He leaned in the booth with the easy posture of command. One arm draped along the backrest, his tattooed fingers curling lazily around the neck of his glass. His eyes, though his eyes were sharp, cold, gray, narrowed, cutting through the smoke like headlights on a dark road. While his men barked and jeered, Ironjaw studied. He studied Alina. She hadn't looked his way yet. She hadn't needed to, but he could tell from the way she held herself back straight, eyes level, boots planted firm, that she wasn't here by accident. Outsiders wandered in sometimes, but outsiders didn't sit so still, in the center of ridicule. Outsiders flinched. Outsiders excused themselves quickly, leaving behind a trail of laughter. She hadn't moved. Ironjaw tapped the rim of his glass with one thick finger. The sound sharp enough that the man nearest him stopped laughing mid-breath. The biker glanced at his leader, then away, and the silence that rippled outward wasn't obvious, but it was there. Ironjaw had spoken without words, and his men felt it. The leader wasn't laughing. He was watching. That meant something. From his booth, Ironjaw could see every detail. The scuffed boots that carried more miles than fashion. The grease stains at the cuff of her sleeve that no wash could fully remove. The shortcut nails of someone who worked with their hands, not polished them. She wasn't a drifter. She wasn't a tourist. She was something else. And he wanted to know what. The bar around them continued its show, but the energy was shifting. Some of the men had noticed their leader's silence and tempered their voices, their laughter carrying less conviction. They glanced between him and Alina, uncertain which way the night was going to tilt. Erenjar finally leaned forward, setting his glass down with a dull thud. The amber liquid rippled once, before settling. He rested his elbows on the table, his hands clasped loosely, his gaze never leaving her. A smirk tugged at one corner of his mouth, slow, deliberate, a challenge without words. He had seen her kind before, people who thought resolve was enough to walk into rooms like this. Resolve cracked fast under pressure. He was waiting to see how long it took. From her stool, Alina reached for her glass again, her movements calm. She still hadn't looked toward him, though the weight of his gaze pressed against her like a hand at her back. She drank, set the glass down gently, and sat in silence. Ironjaw chuckled. Low, just once, the sound like gravel grinding under tires. The men closest to him echoed the noise, not because they understood it, but because they wanted to. His smirk widened, his shoulders straightened, and with a tilt of his chin, he gave the room permission to keep pressing her. The leader had not spoken, not yet. He didn't need to. His presence was enough. His booth was his throne, his silence, his command, and as long as he remained seated, the night belonged to him. But still, his eyes didn't leave her. He had seen plenty of people crumble in this room. Something told him this one wouldn't. And Ironjaw, more than anything, enjoyed a challenge. The laughter rose and fell like waves in a storm, sometimes crashing over her, sometimes pulling back into murmurs, but always circling, always testing. Alina sat at the bar with her glass untouched now, her fingers resting lightly on the rim, her back straight against the invisible weight of every eye in the room. To anyone else, she might have looked indifferent, but the truth was sharper. She was measuring, counting, watching. The mirror behind the bar gave her just enough to see them without turning. A dozen leather vests sprawled across the room, each patched and marked like chapters in a story she wasn't supposed to be part of. Their faces shifted between smirks and sneers, waiting for her to twitch, to flinch, to give them the satisfaction of weakness. They wanted her gone, but more than that, they wanted her broken. Alina didn't move. She breathed slow, steady, the kind of rhythm you learn when you've stood in shops with engines, hissing smoke, when you've had to steady your hands before, tightening a bolt that would keep someone alive on the road. Control, she knew, wasn't just about muscle. It was about stillness. And stillness, in this bar, was the only weapon she could draw without lifting a hand. From his booth, Iron's gaze drilled into her, harder than the laughter. He hadn't spoken yet, hadn't needed to, but she could feel his eyes on her like weight pressing into bone. That was the real challenge. Not the jeers from his men, but the silence from the one who mattered. His smirk sat in the corner of the mirror like a scar, unmoving, waiting for her to meet it. She let them laugh a little longer. Let them throw their words like bottles, sharp and clumsy, each one meant to shatter on her. But inside, she wasn't shrinking. She was narrowing. The noise didn't wash over her, it funneled, pointing her toward the only face in the room that mattered. When she finally turned, it wasn't sudden. It was deliberate, slow, as though she had always meant to. Her stool creaked as she shifted, her body angling just enough to face the corner booth. Her eyes, dark and steady, lifted through the haze of smoke and neon, until they found him. The laughter thinned in that instant, caught on the edge of the moment. Ironjaw sat, as he always did, broad shoulders draped across cracked leather. Fingers curled round his glass, the hint of a smirk still tugging at his jaw. But when their eyes met, something in the room shifted. Alina didn't blink. Her stare was not wild, not defiant in the way of someone desperate to prove themselves. It was calm, exact, like a mechanic examining a machine she already knew how to fix. Her gaze said she wasn't here to play their game, wasn't here to be measured by their rules. She was here on her own terms. Ironjaw's smirk lingered, but it was thinner now, less certain. His men shifted in their seats, glancing between them, sensing a current they didn't understand. The laughter that had filled the room moments earlier stalled, tapering off into murmurs. The bar felt heavier. The jukebox stuttered into silence as a song ended, leaving only the buzz of neon and the scrape of a chair somewhere near the back. In that pause, Elena's eyes did what words couldn't. They challenged him. Not loudly, not theatrically, but with the simple, unshakable truth of someone who refused to be small. Ironjaw leaned forward slowly, his elbows on the table, his gray eyes narrowing. He still didn't speak, but the room tightened anyway, drawn into the quiet duel playing out between their stares. Elena didn't look away. She let the silence stretch, let it choke the room, let every man who had laughed feel the unease of it, because in her eyes was the one thing none of them expected to find here. Not fear, not weakness, but the steady fire of someone who had already decided she would not leave Bode. It was not the laughter that defined the bar anymore. It was the challenge in her eyes. And for the first time, even Iranjar seemed to understand that the night was shifting. The silence in the bar had become a living thing. It hung in the stale air, heavy enough to press against the ribs of every man crowded around the tables. Cigarette smoke curled slowly toward the rafters, its tendrils the only movement in a room that had gone utterly still. Elena's gaze had found Ironjar's, and though no words had passed, everyone understood something had shifted. A line had been drawn, though no one could yet see its shape. One of the bikers, a tall man with a braided beard streaked gray, slammed his empty bottle on the counter. The sound cracked through the stillness like a gunshot. He grinned wide, his teeth yellow under the neon buzz, and leaned toward her with his elbows digging into the wood. "You got a staring problem, sweetheart." His voice was rough, the kind that had barked orders on highways and in bar fights alike. He wanted to reclaim the room, to drag it back into the noise it knew. His grin widened, but his eyes stayed sharp, waiting for her to flinch. Elena didn't. Her hand shifted, slow and deliberate, pushing her glass away until it rested against the far edge of the counter. She straightened her shoulders, her boots steady against the floorboards that creaked with every shift of weight. And then she spoke for the first time since entering. "Funny," she said evenly, her voice carrying enough to cut through the murmurs. "I was just thinking the same about you." A ripple ran through the room. Some of the bikers laughed short, barking bursts that didn't mask their surprise. Others stilled, glancing toward their leader in the corner booth. Ironjaw didn't move, but his eyes narrowed a fraction. The kind of subtle shift that meant he was watching with more intent now. The bearded biker's grin faltered, then hardened. He pushed off the counter, standing taller, his vest shifting as his arms flexed. His boots thudded against the floor as he took one step closer, then another, his shadow falling across her. "You've got a smart mouth," he said, his voice low. "And this ain't the place for it." Elena turned her body slightly, angling toward him without leaving her stool. Her expression didn't change. Calm, steady, almost dismissive. That calmness infuriated him more than any insult could have. The men closest to the scene leaned in, eager for the spark to catch. Their laughter returned in jagged bursts, egging him on, daring him to push further. Someone slapped the table, another muttered, "Show her." The tension curled tighter, wound up in the space between the two. Ironjaw still hadn't moved. His cigar smoldered in the ashtray, forgotten, as his gray eyes stayed locked on Elena. The leader didn't stop his man. He didn't encourage him either. This was the test, and Ironjaw seemed content to let it play out. The biker leaned down now, his face inches from hers, his breath sharp with alcohol. "You think you belong here," he growled. "Prove it." Elena's hand moved before the room registered it. Smooth, practiced, without hesitation. She caught his wrist mid-air as he reached for her, her grip iron around the thick veins of his forearm. The suddenness of it cracked through the room, louder than the bottle slammed before. Chairs scraped back, curses hissed, the crowd leaning closer, in shock. The bearded man froze, blinking down at her hand, gripping his wrist. Her eyes didn't leave his. They held steady, calm as ever, even as her grip tightened enough to make the veins rise under his skin. "You should sit back down," she said softly, almost too softly for the rest of the bar to hear. But the biker heard. He felt it in the way her fingers dug, in the steady pressure that told him she wasn't bluffing. He tried to jerk free. She didn't let him. The bar erupted in noise, half laughter, half outrage, boots thudding against the floor. For the first time that night, Ironjaw leaned forward in his booth, the smirk gone, his expression unreadable. Elena released the man as suddenly as she had grabbed him. He stumbled back a step, his face twisting with a mix of anger and confusion. The crowd roared louder now, some cheering, others jeering, the energy breaking into chaos. But through it all, Elena stayed seated, her boots steady, her eyes returning to Ironjaw's across the room. The first move had been made, and it hadn't been his. The bar was never quiet for long, not with this many boots on the floor and this much liquor in the air. But the silence that followed Elena's grip on the biker's wrist was different. It wasn't peace. It was tension, strung tight like a wire, vibrating under the weight of what had just been witnessed. The bearded man still stood a few feet back, flexing his hand as if trying to shake off the sting of her hold. His pride wounded more than his flesh. His brothers around him barked with disbelief, some slapping the table, some jeering at him for letting himself be caught by a woman. But Alina wasn't watching him anymore. Her eyes were back where they had been from the start, fixed on the man in the corner. Booth Ironjaw. The leader had not spoken a word since she walked in. He hadn't needed to. His silence had been louder than the laughter of his men, louder than the jukebox and the clink of bottles. But now, for the first time that night, he shifted. It was subtle at first. His massive shoulders leaned forward, his palms pressing against the table as though he were measuring the weight of the moment. The men near him quieted, sensing the shift before it fully formed. Imjaw lifted his glass, drained it in one smooth tilt, and set it down with a dull thud that seemed to echo louder than it should. Then he arose. The sound of his boots against the floorboards was slow and deliberate. Each step carried the weight of authority, the kind that came not just from size, but from years of being obeyed. He was taller than most of his men, broad in a way that made the patched leather vest stretch tight against his chest. His beard was thick and black, streaked with iron gray, his jaw set like stone. He didn't raise his voice, didn't need to, because the room had already fallen into near silence. As he crossed it, Alina didn't move. Her hands rested lightly on her thighs, her posture upright, her eyes steady. She didn't flinch when his shadow fell across her, didn't shift when he stopped just a breath away. He studied her, those cold gray eyes scanning her face, her stance, her stillness. "You've got guts," he said finally. His voice a gravel-deep rumble that filled the space between them. The words weren't praise. They were assessment, a measure of value, the way a man might test a blade for sharpness. The crowd chuckled nervously, waiting for more. Some muttered, "Here it comes," expecting the blow, the put-down, the dismissal that would send her scurrying. But Ironjaw didn't raise a fist. He just looked at her, his presence heavy enough that it pressed against her ribs like a physical weight. Alina tilted her head slightly, the corner of her mouth twitching not into a smile, but into something closer to acknowledgement. "Guts," she echoed quietly. "That's one word for it." The men laughed louder now, but it was uneasy laughter, brittle at the edges. Ironjaw didn't join them. He took another step closer, so close now that the smoke on his leather clung to the air between them. "You walk in here like you belong," he said, his voice low. "Like you don't see the walls, the colors, the stairs. You know what happens to people who don't know their place." The room leaned in. Some expected her to shrink. Others wanted her to snap. Alina only breathed once, slow and even, then answered. "Yeah," she said softly. "I've seen it. But I've also seen what happens when the wrong person underestimates the quiet one in the room." The words cut sharper than a knife. For a flicker of a second, something shifted in Ironjaw's expression. Not doubt, not weakness, but recognition. It was gone as fast as it appeared, buried under the steel of his stare. The tension between them was palpable now, a rope pulled taut. Around them, the men muttered, some urging him to put her in her place, others watching with wary fascination. Ironjaw didn't lash out. He didn't need to, by standing there, by letting her answer hang in the smoke-heavy air. He had raised the stakes higher than any shove or swing could. Alina didn't look away. The bar belonged to his men. The night belonged to their noise. But this moment belonged to her. And Ironjaw knew it. When he finally spoke again, his words were measured, deliberate, a warning and a promise all at once. "Careful," he said, his voice gravel low. "Guts only take you so far. After that, it's blood." He turned then, stepping back toward his booth, but the bar wasn't the same. Every man felt it. The leader had risen, had spoken, had measured her and hadn't dismissed her. That silence, that pause, was worth more than the laughter of the room, and Alina knew it was only the beginning. The noise returned slowly, like the hum of an engine turning back over after stalling. Conversations reignited in low tones, but they weren't the same easy banter as before. The bikers' laughter carried a sharper edge now, too loud in some corners, too hushed in others. Even the jukebox, still spitting out its tired country tune, seemed to fall in and out of place with the rhythm of the room. Something had shifted, and every man present could feel it gnawing in the background. Alina remained at the bar, her posture steady, her boots grounded, as if nailed into the wood. She hadn't touched her drink again, and she didn't need to. Her silence was no longer the stillness of an intruder waiting to be judged, had become the stillness of someone who had already claimed a piece of the room. Yet the men weren't about to admit that. not openly. They filled the space with whispers, mutters, sharp enough to cut, but not quite loud enough to challenge outright. She got lucky. One man sneered near the pool table, the cue chalk squeaking in his fingers. Braided beard wasn't paying attention. Bet you wouldn't pull that twice. Another leaned across the table, his voice low, but carrying. Lucky. You see his face when she grabbed him. That wasn't luck, brother. That was something else. Across the room, two younger bikers bent their heads together, their vests creaking as they shifted closer. Ironjaw stood up for the first time in months. One muttered. Didn't even lay a hand on her. Just talked. That's not normal. Not normal, the other agreed, though his tone held less scorn than unease. The whispers grew like weeds through the bar, twisting into every corner. They weren't unified. Some laughed her off, eager to mock the man she'd humiliated. Others eyed her cautiously, wary now in a way that hadn't been there before. What no one said out loud, not yet, was the truth every one of them had felt. When Ironjaw leaned in and let her words hang, this stranger had entered their ground and hadn't been crushed. Alina could hear the murmurs, though she didn't turn her head. Her hearing had sharpened in the silence between words, picking up the cracks in bravado, the nervous chuckles, the skepticism trying to smother curiosity. She knew the rhythm of men trying to explain away what unsettled them. She'd heard it before in gyms, in locker rooms, in alleys where respect wasn't handed but taken. Irinja, back in his booth, hadn't touched his cigar again. He leaned against the torn leather seat, his eyes fixed on the smoke curling upward as though it spelled out something only he could read. His men expected him to make a move, to reassert the order of things. But he didn't. That silence, that pause, only fueled the whispers further. She's nothing. Someone hissed behind her, close enough that she could feel the heat of his breath against her shoulder. He wasn't brave enough to raise his voice, but his hand lingered on the back of her stool, fingers tapping once, twice, as though daring her to react. Alina didn't give him the satisfaction. She didn't turn, didn't flinch. She let the tapping fade into awkward nothing, until he withdrew his hand and muttered a curse under his breath. It was a small thing, but small things piled up fast in rooms like this. The doubts were spreading, now, but not all of them were hers. They belonged to the men. They questioned her, yes, but under that surface ran a darker thread. They questioned what it meant that their leader hadn't crushed her immediately, hadn't dismissed her, as so many others had been. At the bar's far end, a thin man with a scar pulling across his lip leaned toward his neighbor. You think she knows him? From before? His words were sharp, half suspicion, half paranoia. The neighbor grunted, don't matter. If she keeps this up, it's gonna end bloody. That, at least, was something they could agree on. Every whisper, no matter how different, ended at the same conclusion. Blood. Alina sat in the eye of it. Calm as stone, letting their doubts coil tighter. She didn't need to silence them. She just needed to wait. In places like this, whispers did more damage than fists. They burrowed under skin, made men second-guess their own leader, made them wonder if the ground beneath them was as solid as they believed. And already, the cracks were showing. Ironjaw hadn't moved, hadn't spoken again, but the silence that once secured his rule now weighed differently. It no longer silenced the room, it gave space for doubts to grow. Alina didn't smile, but in her stillness, there was a kind of acknowledgement. She had seen this before. Respect wasn't taken all at once. It was chipped from the edges, piece by piece, until the wall came down. Tonight, she had struck the first fracture. The whispers told her it was already spreading. The tension in the bar was no longer hidden in whispers. It had thickened into the air itself, mixing with the smoke and the smell of spilled beer, until every breath carried it. Men shifted on their stools, boots scraping against the sticky floor, eyes darting between Ironjaw in his booth and Alina at the bar. Whatever this night had started as another round of drinks, another brawl waiting to happen, it had become something else. Something none of them had expected. Alina felt it pressing against her, the weight of dozens of stares. Some hostile, some mocking, some wary. It didn't matter which. What mattered was that they were looking at her, not ignoring her, not brushing her aside. That alone was dangerous. The bearded man whose wrist she had caught earlier wasn't laughing anymore. He paced near the pool table, his broad hands clenching and unclenching, like he was fighting the urge to redeem himself. His pride demanded it. His place in the pack demanded it. But even he glanced at Ironjaw before making a move. The leader's silence had become the anchor, holding everyone in place. Finally, the anchor shifted, Ironjaw leaned forward again, his huge frame rising. From the booth with the same deliberate weight as before, the room fell into quiet expectation. No one dared speak now. He didn't stride toward her this time. He stopped just a few steps from his table, his gravel-deep voice cutting through the hush. "You walk in here and make a scene," he said, the words slow and measured. "You catch one man's hand, and suddenly they think you're something. But we don't deal in whispers here. We deal in proof." The bar erupted with approving growls, boots stomping against the floorboards, fists pounding on tables. Proof. That was the language they understood. Ironjaw had spoken it, and now the challenge was no longer implied. It was laid bare. Elena met his eyes, unblinking. She had known it would come to this. Words could only carry so far in a place like this, before fists had to pick up where they left off. She rose from her stool, slow, unhurried, her boots landing with a thud that carried farther than expected in the silence that followed. "Proof," she said evenly, her voice carrying clear despite the noise simmering beneath. "What kind of proof are you looking for?" Ironjaw's lip curled, not quite a smile, not quite a snarl. The kind that leaves no doubts. He lifted a hand, gesturing toward the open floor between the pool table and the bar. A crude kind of arena, cleared by the weight of his words. Alone, men shoved stools back, giving space. The air grew hotter with the press of bodies crowding around. The bearded man snapped to attention, his pride flaring like a struck match. "Let me," he growled, already stepping forward, eager to prove himself again. His eyes burned, his fists clenched, his humiliation begging for blood. Ironjaw didn't look at him. His gaze stayed locked on Elena. Then, after a long pause that stretched the silence into something suffocating, he nodded once. "You want to stand here? Prove it against him." The crowd roared. The bearded man grinned, his teeth bared in triumph as he rolled his shoulders, ready to make her regret every second of defiance. But under the cheers, under the boots stomping against the wood, there was another current curiosity. No one could deny she had caught him before. Now, they wanted to see if she could do it again, when the rules were clear and the stakes higher. Elena didn't move at first. She let the roar of the crowd wash over her, let the man's swagger fill the space, let the challenge sit in the air until the anticipation twisted tighter. Only then did she step forward into the circle, her expression calm, her shoulders squared. "I'll give you proof," she said softly. It wasn't for the crowd. It wasn't even for Ironjaw. It was for herself. The bearded man cracked his knuckles, circling her like a predator, sure of his kill. His men shouted encouragements, their voices echoing in the small bar. But others watched quietly, their expressions tight, their doubt from before not fully. He raced. Ironjaw folded his arms, his gray eyes sharp and unyielding. He had called for proof, and now he would get it. But even he couldn't predict whether this would restore the order of his bar, or shatter it completely. The challenge had been laid bare. The only thing left was to see who walked away from it standing. The crowd pressed in until the walls themselves seemed to bend inward, trapping the tension inside the smoke-filled bar. Every man leaned forward, boots planted hard against the sticky floorboards, as if bracing for an earthquake. Elena stood in the circle of space carved out between the pool table and the bar, her shoulders steady, her gaze locked on the bearded biker who had been given the chance to reclaim his pride. He circled her, the thick chains around his neck clinking. With every step, the smirk on his face spreading wider with each cheer from his brothers. He had been humiliated once, already caught, restrained, and dismissed. Now, in front of everyone, he had been handed redemption. He needed this, and the desperation burned in his eyes. "You're not leaving here walking," he spat, his voice thick with drink and fury. His hands balled into fists, knuckles whitening, veins rising across the backs of his hands. He was taller than her by half a head, broader by twice, and convinced that size was the only measure that mattered. The first swing came quick, too quick for a man his size, as if his rage alone had lent him speed. His right fist cut through the air with a whistle, aimed straight for her jaw. The crowd roared, certain it would end the fight before it began. But Elena moved before the strike even reached her. She tilted her head just enough that the fist grazed past her cheek, missing by an inch. Her body pivoted with the motion, her right boot sliding across the wood in a low arc, grounding her balance. She didn't stumble. She didn't flinch. The blow that should have dropped her left him overextended, leaning forward, his chest open. She could have counted then. A quick strike to his ribs, a hook beneath his jaw. But she didn't. She stepped back instead, letting him right himself, letting him stew in the failure of his first swing. The crowd's roar stumbled into silence, a collective exhale of disbelief. The biker's face twisted, his grin cracking into something uglier. He swung again, this time with his left, slower but heavier, his entire shoulder rolling with the force. Alina ducked under it, her braid whipping through the smoky air as his arm cut harmlessly above her head. Again, the crowd gasped. "Stand still, you," he snarled. But his words dissolved into a grunt as he lunged forward, both arms outstretched now, trying to grab hold of her. His tactics were slipping from fists to brute grappling, the kind that ended in broken tables and smashed glass. Alina didn't give him the chance. She pivoted again, sidestepping his lunge, her hands grazing his arm just long enough to redirect his momentum. He stumbled forward, crashing against the pool table with a thud that rattled the balls across the felt. His brothers cheered louder, but the laughter that followed was cut with unease. Twice now, he had missed. Twice now, she had slipped free. Irinjaw hadn't moved. He watched from his place near the booth, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. But his eyes tracked every motion with sharp precision. This wasn't entertainment, to him it was assessment. The bearded man turned, his face red, sweat glistening against his temple. He roared, the sound guttural, and charged again. This time Alina didn't step aside. She let him close the distance, his arm swinging wide once more. At the last second, she raised her forearm, catching his strike and redirecting the force upward. The impact jolted her bones, but she held steady. Before he could recover, her elbow drove hard into his chest. The sound that followed wasn't a cheer, it was a collective gasp. He staggered backward, clutching his ribs, the air knocked clean out of him. Alina didn't chase him. She straightened, calm, breathing even, as though she had done nothing more than brush dust from her jacket. The first swing had been his moment to end her. Instead, it had become hers to show the bar that she wouldn't break. The room erupted again. Not in uniform shouts of triumph, but in fractured noisome jeering him, some calling her lucky, others standing silent, caught between disbelief and curiosity. Irinjaw's gaze narrowed. The first swing had been thrown, but the fight was only beginning. The air inside the bar grew thicker, as if smoke alone could no longer account for it. Every man, whether leaning against the wall or gripping the edge of the pool table, had his gaze fixed on the circle where Alina and the bearded biker stood. The fight was no longer his alone, it was theirs too. Each man in leather, each scarred face, seemed to measure her with their eyes, weighing whether she was an interloper to be crushed or something far more dangerous. Alina stood with her shoulders square, breathing slow and steady. The biker, red-faced and wheezing from her last strike, paced in frustration. He wanted to finish it quickly now, to reclaim not just his pride, but the respect that had slipped from him the moment she caught his wrist earlier. But the weight of the crowd was no longer behind him with the same certainty. They had seen her slip past his swings, seen her plant an elbow in his chest without flinching. Doubt had entered the room, and doubt was poison in a place where dominance was survival. Some laughed, masking their unease with mockery. "She's just quick," one shouted over the noise. "Let him grab hold. She'll crumble." Others muttered quieter, their tone less sure. "She's different," another said, voice low but audible. "She's not rattled." Alina heard it all, but she didn't let it pull her from the present moment. Her eyes moved over the crowd with the same calm steadiness as her breathing. She saw the younger bikers, their jaws slack with disbelief, hungry for the spectacle, but not sure where to cast their loyalty yet. She saw the older ones, men with broken noses and gray threading their beards, watching with harder eyes, knowing the balance of power was delicate. Too delicate. If she humiliated him again, it wouldn't just be his pride that suffered. The entire bar's hierarchy would feel the crack. Irinjaw had not spoken since declaring the challenge, but his silence was heavier than any voice. He leaned back against the booth's wooden frame, his arms crossed, his jaw unmoving. Yet his gaze never shifted. Every flicker of Alina's movement, every stumble of his man, was marked and stored behind those slate-gray eyes. He was a man who could weigh truth in silence, and tonight, she was forcing him to weigh something no outsider had ever made him consider. The bearded biker lunged again, more out of desperation than precision. His arms swept wide, trying to envelop her in brute force. For a split second, Alina's boot slid across the sticky floor, her balance tested under the raw strength of his grasp. The crowd shouted encouragement, stomping and clapping, as if their noise could press him into victory. But then she shifted, her body lowered just enough, her grip catching his arm at the elbow, her weight leaning into his charge instead of away from it. With one sharp motion, she used his momentum against him. He crashed forward, his body slamming into the wooden floor with a crack that silenced the cheering mid-roar. For a moment, the only sound was the hum of the old neon sign above the bar, buzzing faintly like an insect trapped in glass. The biker groaned, trying to push himself up, but Alina stood over him already, calm, collected, her chest rising and falling with steady rhythm. The crowd reacted in waves. The younger men gasped, some laughing nervously, not sure if they were witnessing something impossible or merely improbable. The older ones frowned, eyes narrowing, recognizing the discipline in her movements, the controlled efficiency that wasn't born of luck. One voice cut through the noise. "She's making him look like a fool." It was said low, but the ripple of agreement was louder than any shout. The bar had seen fights before, dozens, maybe hundreds. They knew when a man was outclassed. Ironjaw's expression finally shifted. His lip curled slightly, a flicker of something between amusement and warning. He didn't move yet, but every man who caught the look knew it. The leader was measuring how far this would go, how far he would let it go, before his silence had to end. The biker, face pressed against the floorboards, pushed himself up to his knees, rage shaking through his frame. He was beaten already, but pride refused to let him stop. Alina didn't. Advanced, she let him rise, her eyes never leaving his, as if daring him to make the next move. And as she stood there, calm and unyielding, the eyes of the crowd no longer saw a woman out of place. They saw someone standing against one of their own and not bending. That alone was enough to shift the room into unfamiliar territory. Ironjaw finally leaned forward, his heavy boots scraping the floor as he prepared to speak. The crowd hushed, instantly, every pair of eyes snapping to him. What he said next would decide whether this night ended in recognition or in ruin. The bar was never quiet. Not on a Friday, not with the jukebox rattling against the wall, not with laughter spilling out of throats thickened by beer. But now, silence pressed down on the room like a suffocating weight. Even the jukebox seemed to stutter into hush, the guitar riff dying under the gravity of what had unfolded. Alina stood with her back straight, her hands loose at her sides, every nerve alive but her face unreadable. Across from her, the bearded biker wiped blood from the corner of his mouth, his eyes red and wet with humiliation. He had swung, missed, been thrown down, and every second of his failure was burned into the eyes of his brothers. No one jeered. This time, no one shouted encouragement or mockery. Instead, boots shifted on the wooden floor. Throats cleared. The men who had laughed loudest earlier now found their voices gone, their gazes darting between the fallen man and the woman who had made him stumble. Silence in a place like this was not peace. It was judgment. It was the moment when men measured what they had seen and decided what it meant for them, for the order of the bar, for the hierarchy that kept them from turning on each other. And right now, they didn't know where to place her. Alina felt it, not just the silence, but the sharpness of it, the way every eye in the room became a blade. She had been in hostile spaces before, places where being underestimated was as dangerous as being challenged outright. But this was different. Here, respect and violence were bound so tightly that one could turn into the other. Without warning, the biker finally pushed himself fully to his feet. His chest rose and fell like bellows, his hands trembling, whether from rage or exhaustion, it was impossible to tell. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words never came. He looked at her, then at Ironjaw, then at the crowd that no longer chanted his name. The silence crushed him, more than her strikes had. Ironjaw had not moved, but his presence loomed larger than ever. He sat in the booth, arms folded, one finger tapping against the table in a slow, steady rhythm. Every man in the room seemed to lean toward that sound, as if it were the only heartbeat that mattered. Elena's eyes flicked to him briefly, then back to the man in front of her. She wasn't done, and neither was he. The silence deepened into something heavier expectation. The bar wanted Ironjaw to speak, to break the stillness with his verdict. But he didn't. He let it stretch, let it grind against their nerves, because he knew silence was its own kind of power. The biker broke first. "This ain't over," he muttered, voice hoarse, spit hitting the floor. He pointed at Alina though. His hand shook too much to carry weight. "You got lucky." One more time. The words were cut off by Ironjaw's voice. Low, rough, final. Enough. The room froze. The sound of that single word hit harder than any fist. The biker's mouth shut instantly, his finger dropping, his entire body shrinking under the leader's command. Ironjaw's gaze moved from him to Alina. He studied her. His jaw set, his eyes unreadable. The silence shifted again, not just wait, but warning. The bar leaned into it, breath held, waiting to see what he would say. But Ironjaw didn't say more. He let his words stand alone, hanging in the thick air. It wasn't forgiveness, and it wasn't approval. It was pause. It was judgment deferred. Elena didn't move. She let the silence hold, refusing to shrink from it, refusing to fill it with words or excuses. She met his gaze with the same steadiness she had shown in the fight. The bar breathed shallow, every man sensing the balance shifting, though none of them yet knew where it would settle. Silence had done what fists could not. Tit had turned the night into something larger than a fight, larger than pride. In the weight of that silence, the real test began. Ironjaw rose slowly, his frame unfolding with deliberate intent. The scrape of his boots against the wooden floor was louder than any voice had been in the last several minutes. Men shifted aside without being told, clearing a path as though instinct alone demanded it. He didn't rush, didn't bark, didn't need to. The authority in his silence carried him forward, each step drawing every eye in the bar to him. Elena stayed still. Her heart drummed against her ribs, but her breathing stayed even, steady. She had known from the moment she entered this place that the fight with the bearded biker was not the true battle. It was only the razor. The man who mattered was stepping into the light now, and the weight of the bar's hierarchy pressed against her shoulders like invisible chains. Ironjaw stopped just a few feet from her. He was taller than she had expected, broad in the chest, his leather vest worn at the edges like old armor. His beard was streaked with gray, his eyes the pale color of winter steel. Up close, he smelled of smoke, sweat, and something heavier. This was a man who had fought, ruled, and survived more nights like this than anyone else in the room. He said nothing at first. He only looked at her, his gaze dragging across her face, her stance, her hands that hung loose but ready. Around them, the men of the bar seemed to vanish. The crowd that had been so loud earlier was now nothing but shadows, their breaths swallowed into silence. For them, this was no longer entertainment. It was a test. Elena met his eyes and held them. She didn't fidget, didn't look away. She knew that dropping her gaze would read as weakness, but challenging too directly would read as defiance. What was required now was balance, the same balance she had carried into the fight. The same balance that let her use strength against itself. Ironjaw circled her once. Slow, each step a drag of his boots against the sticky floorboards. He wasn't in a hurry. He was measuring her, not by words, but by presence. He stopped behind her for a moment, close enough that she could feel the heat of him at her back. The bar held its breath. Then he stepped to her side, his eyes never leaving hers as he came full circle. "You walk in here," he said finally, his voice like gravel rolling in a barrel. "You make a show of my man. You think that earns you something." His tone wasn't anger, not yet. It was calculation. Elena's voice came out steady, even though her pulse raced. "I didn't come here for him. And I didn't come here for you. I came here because I was told I wouldn't last 5 minutes in a place like this." The corner of Ironjaw's mouth twitched, but not into a smile. "And you want to prove them wrong?" "I don't care about proving anything," she said. "I just don't like being told where I don't belong." That earned a ripple from the crowd, low murmurs breaking the silence. Some smirked, others frowned. The bar was split. Half wanted to see her crushed under the weight of the leader's authority. The other half couldn't help but respect the raw defiance in her words. Ironjaw's eyes narrowed. He stepped closer until his shadow swallowed hers. "Belonging here ain't about what you like or don't like. It's about who can carry weight when it's thrown at them. You've shown me speed. You've shown me balance. But weight," he leaned in slightly. "Weight breaks most people in the end." He straightened, letting his words hang. His men looked to him, waiting for the signal. Would he order her thrown out, or would he test her himself? Elena didn't move. Her silence wasn't submission. It was its own kind of reply. She wasn't here to plead, and she wasn't here to posture. Ironjaw studied her one last time. Then, with a slow nod, he stepped back, his boots echoing against the floor. "We'll see," he said simply, his voice carrying like a hammer. The crowd stirred again, restless, uncertain. For the first time in years, Ironjaw hadn't ended a challenge with a blow or a dismissal. He had left it open, and that unsettled them more than any fight could. The moment Ironjaw stepped back, the air in the bar shifted. The tension that had been stretched taut began to unravel into hushed murmurs. Men who had been silent now leaned toward one another, voices low, their words curling into the cigarette smoke that hung heavy above the tables. The bar was alive again, but in a different way. No longer laughter, no longer jeers. Now it was whispers, measured, cautious, and thick with unease. Alina felt the change before she fully heard it. The sharpness of eyes on her dulled, replaced by sideways glances exchanged between men who had seen their order shaken. She remained where she was, back straight, hands relaxed, refusing to give ground. Moving too quickly, speaking too soon either, would make her look desperate. So she stood in the silence between whispers, becoming a figure for the room to measure against their doubts. At a corner table, two bikers leaned over their half-empty pitchers, their beards brushing against the rims as they spoke. He didn't shut her down. One muttered, his voice gravelly with disbelief. Ironjaw always shuts him down. Maybe he's testing her, the other replied, though his tone lacked conviction. Maybe he wants to see if she folds when it's quiet. Across the room, a younger biker with wide eyes whispered too loudly. She dropped Mason like he was nothing. You see the way she twisted him down. A quick slap to the back of his head from an older member cut him off. But the words lingered. The older man hissed, "Keep your mouth shut. Don't get ideas." Whispers carried weight here. They moved like currents under the surface, invisible but powerful enough to shift the direction of the whole tide. Alina knew that in places like this, strength wasn't measured only in fist. It was measured in the stories people repeated when the night was done. Right now, she was becoming a story. Near the bar, the bartender polished the same glass over and over, his eyes darting nervously between Ironjaw and Alina. He had seen hundreds of fights, dozens of outsiders walk in too bold and leave too broken, but never had he seen Ironjaw leave judgment hanging in the air. That unsettled him most. He muttered to no one in particular, "Ain't right, leaving it open like that. Gonna eat at the men." The jukebox finally sparked back to life, a guitar riff filling the silence, but it only underscored the whispers instead of covering them. Laughter returned in fragments, brittle and sharp, forced into the spaces between uncertainty. A few men returned to their pool game, but their shots clattered too hard. Their focus shattered. Alina let herself glance once at Ironjaw. He had reclaimed his booth, his massive arms folded again, his gaze unreadable. He said nothing, but his silence was different now. It was deliberate, almost baiting. He wanted to see what his men would do with the void his words had left. He wanted to know if the bar could hold itself together without him forcing it. The whispers told her everything. Some feared her, some doubted her, and some dangerously admired her. She could feel it building like smoke in the lungs. A mixture of awe and unease. A group of 3 bikers rose from their table, their boots heavy against the floorboards. They didn't approach her directly, not yet, but they circled nearer, testing the air around her, their words low but sharp. "Doesn't belong here," one said. "Don't matter what she did to Mason. Don't matter what Ironjaw said or didn't say. Doesn't belong." Another chuckled, though it lacked conviction. "Belonging ain't the point anymore, is it? She's in it now. Can't walk out the same way she walked in." Their whispers turned into a warning, audible enough for her to catch. She had passed the first test, maybe even the second. But the bar was not finished. If anything, the silence had only fed the hunger for more. Alina steadied her breath, the stale smoke burning her throat. She knew the next move wouldn't come from her. It would come from the men who whispered in shadows, pushing themselves toward a decision. And when it came, she would have to be ready not for the fight she had just won, but for the one the whispers promised was still ahead. The whispers didn't fade, they hardened. What began as murmurs carried under smoke, and beer-soaked breath grew sharper, heavier, until the air itself seemed to vibrate with unspoken demand. In a place like this, silence could only stretch so long before it had to be broken, and when it did, it broke with force. A chair scraped across the floor, its legs dragging out a shrill cry that cut through the guitar riff humming from the jukebox. Heads turned. From the far side of the bar, a man with arms thick as tree trunks and tattoos crawling up his neck stood tall, his beer glass abandoned half full. His leather vest carried no name across the back, only the insignia of the club. But everyone knew him. Rook, second in command, the one who spoke when Ironjaw chose not to. He didn't bother with subtlety. His voice was thunder, raw and direct. "This ain't how it works." The room stilled. "You don't just walk in, throw one of ours down, and stand there like you've earned a seat at the table." Alina didn't move. She had expected this. Ironjaw's silence wasn't an end. It was an opening, and now Rook had stepped into it. Rook's eyes cut into her, dark and mean. His jaw clenched so tight the tendons showed through his skin. You want to stand in this place? Then you stand against more than one man. You stand against the weight of all of us. That's how you earn your breath in here. Around him, men grunted their approval. Boots stomped once, twice, building rhythm. The bar's energy shifted, growing louder, more dangerous. The whispers that had wavered between doubt and respect now turned into something collective. A chant without words, the bar demanding blood to settle its balance. Irinjor leaned back in his booth, his expression carved from stone. He neither stopped Rook nor encouraged him. His silence was permission enough. Alina straightened her shoulders, though her body thrummed with fatigue beneath her skin. She knew the trick wasn't in brute force. She had already shown that. It was in balance, in control, in refusing to let the challenge itself dictate her fear. Her eyes locked on Rook's, unwavering. "If that's what you want," she said, evenly, her voice carrying just enough to cut across the bar, "then say it plain." Rook smirked, a cruel twist of his lips. He stepped closer, the floorboards groaning beneath his weight. The men at the nearest table pulled their chairs back, clearing the space without being asked. "I'll say it plain," he growled. "You and me, here now." The bar erupted not in chaos, but in dark excitement. Men slapped tables, laughter barked sharp, voices rose with a feverish hunger. A new fight had been declared, and in their world, nothing drew loyalty or settled doubt like violence witnessed firsthand. The bartender muttered under his breath as he pulled another glass. "Fool's game, Rook. Fool's game." But even he didn't dare raise his voice above the tide. Alina let the noise wash over her, her eyes never leaving the man who now stood before her. He was broader, heavier, more dangerous than Mason had been. He wouldn't come at her drunk and sloppy. He would come at her to break. Still, she did not flinch. She didn't look away. "Then clear the floor," she said. Her tone was not boast, not plea, but fact. That silenced them all for a heartbeat. It was the moment she took what was thrown at her and returned it without hesitation. Rook sneered. But there was a flicker in his eyes, something between rage and recognition. He turned to the crowd, spreading his arms wide. "Clear it," he barked. And they did. Tables scraped back, chairs pushed aside. The open space grew in the center of the bar, the neon lights buzzing above it like witnesses waiting for blood. Ironjaw's gaze flicked once toward Alina, his expression unreadable. Then he looked away, as though what was about to happen was not his concern. The challenge had been declared. The floor was open, and in the heartbeat before the fight began, the bar itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see if the woman who had dared walk into their world could stand against the storm she had just accepted. The room rearranged itself with an efficiency born of ritual. Tables shoved against walls, stools stacked in corners, ashtrays scooped up and dumped, leaving only a bare stretch of warped wooden floor. The neon glow overhead flickered green and red across faces that leaned in, ringed close, but not too close. Forming the circle, it was the same circle that had contained 100 brawls before this one, each burned into memory by bruises and scars. Tonight, that circle was hers. Alina stood in its center, calm but aware, her boots pressed against sticky floorboards where spilled beer clung, her breath steady despite the pulse hammering in her veins. She could feel their eyes, hundreds of them, pinned to her back and shoulders. None of them had expected her to still be standing by this point. That was the power of the circle. It demanded spectacle, and they were waiting to see if she would falter under it. Rook stepped forward from the edge, shrugging off his vest so it dropped into the arms of a man beside him. His broad chest gleamed with sweat, the tattoos scrawled across his skin, twisting with the flex of muscle. He flexed his hands, thick fingers curling into fists. He wasn't like Mason. Mason had been reckless, too eager. Rook was deliberate. He knew how to use his size, how to drag a fight into exhaustion, how to grind an opponent down until only one of them could stand. The circle tightened. Men leaning inward, shoulders pressed against shoulders, their whispers giving way to low growls of anticipation. Someone slapped a boot against the floor. 3 sharp beats. Others joined in, pounding the rhythm against tables and walls, until the whole bar throbbed with it. It was their way of sanctifying the fight, of reminding both fighters they were not alone, that the bar itself demanded its due. Alina raised her chin. Her gaze locked on Rook. She refused to let the circle dictate her fear. Every step she had taken tonight had brought her deeper into this, and turning back was no longer possible. The only way out was through. Rook smirked, circling her like a predator testing distance. "Thought you were tough, huh? Mason was nothing. I'm the one who'll remind you where you belong." His words weren't meant to wound, he didn't care if they did. They were for the audience. For the men pressed close enough to hear every breath. He was reminding them of the order she had disrupted. Alina let him circle. Her stance light, balanced, not wasting motion. She had no illusions. She couldn't overpower him. But power wasn't what had brought her this far. Timing, precision, control. She had to wait for his opening. The single mistake even the strongest men made. When they were too certain of victory, the air was thick with smoke and breath and expectation. The circle swayed with each step, men shifting forward as if drawn by invisible cords. The smell of leather and beer and sweat tightening around her. For them, this wasn't just a fight. It was judgment, and they all hungered to see it delivered. The bartender, polishing a glass with hands that shook, muttered under his breath, "God help her." But his words vanished in the pounding rhythm that grew louder with every beat. Rook stopped circling. He squared his shoulders, his fists rising, and for a moment, the bar fell utterly silent. All sound sucked inward. Anticipation coiled tighter than breath. Alina knew the silence was a blade edge to the moment before impact, when everything was possible and nothing yet decided. Then the first move came. Rook lunged, the circle erupting in cheers and roars as the storm began. The silence shattered in an instant, like glass under a hammer. Rook lunged with the speed of a man who had lived half his life inside fights, his shoulder driving forward, fist cocked low and fast. The crowd surged with him, their voices splitting into cheers and curses, as though each man had a stake in the outcome. Boots stomped the floor in unison, rattling glasses left on the bar. Elena's eyes didn't leave his chest. She had learned, long ago, that fists could deceive, but the body's center never lied. The shift of weight, the twist of hips, it told the truth before the punch was even thrown. She leaned back, letting the fist slice through the air, close enough that she felt the wind graze her jaw. Gasps erupted around the circle. Rook wasn't used to missing, but missing didn't slow him. He twisted, driving an elbow upward, the motion sharp and ruthless. Alina ducked, the move grazing her hair as she dropped low, boots squealing against the sticky boards. Her knee bent, and she slid a half-step sideways, her palm brushing the floor to keep balance. The crowd roared louder, the circle pressing tighter, the smell of leather and smoke thick enough to burn the throat. It wasn't just a fight anymore. It was theater. Every dodge, every strike, every grunt of impact was fuel for the men who lived for nights like this. Rook growled, his teeth bared, and swung again. This time Alina didn't step away. She stepped in. Her hand shot forward, catching his wrist mid-swing, twisting with precision. His fist stalled inches from her shoulder, trapped in her grip. The men at the edge howled in disbelief. Some laughed, others spat curses, but all of them leaned forward, unable to look away. Rook's bellow shook the air as he tried to yank his arm free, but Alina was already moving. She pivoted, her body tight against his, dragging his momentum past her. His shoulder jerked forward, unbalanced. She struck his ribs with her elbow, not hard enough to finish him, but sharp enough to remind him she wasn't here to be broken. The thud echoed like a drumbeat. Rook stumbled 2 steps before regaining balance, his glare burning holes into her. He rubbed his ribs, his chest heaving. For the first time, the certainty in his eyes faltered, just for a flicker. Lucky, he spat, his voice ragged, but the crowd knew better. Luck didn't twist a wrist like that. Luck didn't put a man like Rook off his center dot. Alina didn't reply. Words wouldn't hold here. Only motion would. She straightened her stance again, her feet apart, arms loose, her gaze steady. She gave him no smirk, no challenge, just silence. That pressed heavier than anything she could have said. The bar pulsed with noise, boots hammering, hands slapping tables, voices shouting for more. They wanted blood. They wanted resolution. But above all, they wanted spectacle. And Alina had already given them more, in 2 moves, than Mason had in his entire drunken stumble. Rook lowered his head, nostrils flaring, a bull readying to charge. His pride had been scratched. And that was a wound no man in this place could leave unanswered. He lunged again, heavier, angrier, his fists pounding forward in a storm. Alina met the storm not with strength, but with patience. She swayed, ducked, stepped aside, each motion conserving energy, each dodge forcing him to burn more of his. The crowd's roars blurred into one long growl, the room itself shaking with the rhythm of fists on flesh and boots on boards. And then, at last, her chance opened. His shoulder rolled too wide, his stance too spread. She stepped in, sharp as a blade, her palm striking his chest with precise force. Rook staggered back, slammed against the circle's edge, men clutching their beers, stumbling to keep him upright. The first strike had landed, and the bar knew it. Rook pushed himself off the shoulders of the men at the circle's edge, their laughter cutting sharp into his pride. The hit hadn't knocked him down, but it had bruised something worse than bone. His ego. In this bar, in this circle, reputation mattered more than money or titles. And Alina had just torn a strip from his dot, his face twisted as he straightened. Breath flaring from his nostrils, like a bull scenting blood. Sweat gleamed across his forehead, sliding into the creases of his tattoos. He rolled his neck, joints cracking like gunshots, and then flexed his fists with the slow, deliberate menace of a man about to stop playing games. The crowd felt it instantly. The energy shifted from raucous amusement to something darker, heavier. Boots stopped pounding for rhythm. Voices hushed to a tense murmur. They knew this side of Rook, the part that didn't care about putting on a show. The part that ended fights so decisively, men remembered them years later. Enough, he growled, his voice raw, carrying above the smoky din. You're done. Alina didn't answer. She knew better. He wanted her to trade words, to meet his fury with fire, to step into the trap of his tempo. Silence was her weapon. Her stillness was a blade. She steadied her stance, eyes locked to his chest again, waiting. Rook didn't wait. He exploded forward, no feints, no showmanship, just brute force. His fist swung wide, a barrage meant to overwhelm, to corner her before she could think. The air snapped with the violence of each blow, his body battering forward like a storm set loose. Alina dodged 1, 2, 3 strikes, each closer than the last. The fourth grazed her shoulder, sending pain radiating down her arm. She staggered but didn't fall, forcing her feet to reset before he could close the gap. The men in the circle erupted, roaring at the near miss, their voices battering her ears as hard as Rook's fists. To them, it was blood. They wanted her blood. They smelled weakness in her stagger. Rook saw it too. He pressed harder, throwing his full weight into a blow meant to break ribs. Alina shifted just enough that his knuckles slammed into the wood of a support beam instead. The crack was sickening, louder than the cheers that followed. He bellowed in pain, clutching his hand. The skin split, blood already slicking his knuckles. It should have slowed him, but fury masked the pain. He swung with the other fist, wild and reckless now. Alina ducked low, the air of the punch ruffling her hair. She countered, her elbow smashing against his side. The impact echoed, but Rook grunted, and barely faltered. His fury made him dangerous. Every blow carried the weight of desperation now, the refusal to lose in front of his men. His teeth clenched, eyes bloodshot with rage. He caught her sleeve, yanking her forward. His knee shot up, colliding with her thigh, a blunt force that sent a shock of pain shooting through her leg. Alina gasped, stumbling but refusing to fall. She twisted, wrenching free from his grip, her body rolling across the sticky boards to escape his reach. She came up to her feet quickly, but the ache in her leg throbbed like fire. The crowd howled approval of his brutality. They wanted her, broken, wanted the fight to end with their leader's dominance intact. Rook spat blood onto the floor and squared himself again, chest heaving. He was smiling now, teeth red, not because he had gained control, but because the fight had finally become what he wanted. Raw, savage, unrelenting. And though Alina hurt, though her body screamed from the hits she had taken, her mind cut through the smoke of pain with clarity. Rook's fury was his weapon, but it was also his flaw. Fury made men sloppy. Fury opened doors. The bar rattled with noise, men calling for her collapse, for Rook's victory. But as he lunged once more, Alina's eyes caught that single, fleeting, weakness, the door opening wider, and she knew it was time to step through. Rook lunged again, his body a wall of rage crashing forward. The crowd surged with him, voices breaking into a chorus of shouts, boots hammering the floor as if trying to shake the building apart. His fists tore through the air, each one aimed not just to bruise but to end. He wanted Alina on the ground, broken, humiliated before every man in leather watching. But Alina had waited for this. She had studied his rhythm, the cycle of anger feeding into power, then slipping into recklessness. His steps grew heavier, his punches wider. He stopped aiming and started swinging, each strike fueled by pride, not precision. She let him close. The distance, the smell of sweat and blood hit her. As he came in, his chest heaving, his breath hot and ragged. He swung again, his fist arcing toward her head. She ducked, her boots sliding across the sticky boards. Her body coiled like a spring dart, and then she moved. Her hand shot up, catching his wrist mid-swing. With a twist that seemed almost too sharp for its speed, she wrenched it sideways, pulling his momentum into her control. At the same time, she stepped into his space, her shoulder driving forward with practiced precision. His body folded with the force, and before the crowd had time to process, his back slammed against the wall. The sound cracked through the bar like a gunshot. Glass rattled on shelves. Men froze mid-cheer, mouths open, as they saw their leader, pinned, his arm bent high. Elena's palm locked against his chest, her forearm pressed across his throat. The fight stopped in that heartbeat. Rook snarled, his face red, teeth bared as he tried to push free. But she had him. Her stance was perfect. Her body braced against his weight. His size meant nothing now. His fury meant nothing. The leverage was hers. His boot scraped uselessly against the floor, the muscles in his arms straining. But Elena didn't budge. The silence in the bar was sudden and heavy. Even the buzzing neon seemed quieter. Dozens of men in leather stared at their leader. Men they had followed into brawls, into rides across empty highways, into nights of violence and loyalty, and they watched him caught like a wild animal, unable to break free. Rook roared, his voice muffled against her arm. He tried to knee her, tried to shove his weight forward, but she slammed him harder into the boards. The wall groaned under the impact, dust shaking from the ceiling. Her eyes never wavered. They weren't wild with triumph or sharp with mockery. They were calm, focused, steady. She wasn't fighting for the crowd. She wasn't fighting for pride. She was simply showing him every man who doubted that she could not be broken. The bar breathed in unison. A low murmur starting at the edges, disbelief mixing with awe. Some muttered curses under their breath. Others chuckled in shock. A few even grinned, respect creeping into their eyes against their will. Rook thrashed once more, veins bulging in his neck, but the truth was written across his face. He wasn't getting freed out. Elena leaned in closer, her forearm pressing just enough to choke off his last attempt at resistance. Her voice cut through the silence, low and sharp, carrying across the room without needing to be raised. Enough. The word cracked like a whip. It wasn't shouted. It didn't need to be. Rook's fists fell to his sides. His chest still heaved, his jaw clenched, but his fight drained out of him. The wall behind his back was colder than the realization settling into his mind. He had been beaten, and everyone had seen it. The crowd erupted not in jeers, not in anger, but in chaos. Some laughed nervously, others hollered in disbelief, and a few even clapped their hands against tables, the sound echoing like thunder. The leader of the bar had been pinned to the wall, and the one who did it wasn't one of them. It was her. The moment stretched longer than anyone expected. Rook's chest still heaved, his bulk trembling as Elena's forearm pressed him into the stained wooden wall. His men had roared through every stage of the fight, their voices shaking the rafters. But now they stood still, every laugh and jeer stolen from their throats. The silence was the loudest sound in the room. Elena could feel the thump of his pulse beneath her grip, the coarse heat of his breath rushing against her arm. She didn't loosen, not yet. Her stance was solid, her body steady, her mind cutting through the chaos with calm. In that stillness, she had turned the storm into nothing more than wind brushing against her. Rook tried once more to jerk free, but the effort was weak, drained of the fury that had fueled him minutes earlier. He had come at her with everything, and still, he was here, pinned like a schoolyard bully caught by the wrist. His pride bled faster than the cut on his knuckles. At last, Elena shifted her weight back, not as a gift but as a choice. She released him with precision, her movements deliberate, her message clear. He slid against the wall, as though gravity had taken over, his boots catching him just before his knees buckled. His hands dropped to his sides, his chest pumping in shallow, furious breaths. No one moved. No one spoke. Even the bartender, who had been polishing glasses with the same rag since the fight began, stood frozen with a glass half wiped, his eyes fixed on the scene. The neon sign buzzing above the bar flickered, the only sound filling the gap where cheers and laughter had once been. Elena adjusted her jacket, brushed dust from her sleeve as if she had only leaned against the wall herself. Her eyes scanned the room, meeting the stares of men who had moments ago wanted her broken. Some avoided her gaze, others held it longer than they meant to. Curiosity mixed with something foreign - respect. She didn't need to say a word. The silence said enough. Rook, still propped against the wall, wiped blood from his mouth with the back of his hand. His eyes burned with rage, but beneath it, something else flickered in understanding he didn't want to admit. He had been bested, and nothing could erase the memory of it. From the men who had watched, one of them, a broad man with a scar down his cheek, broke the silence first. His laugh cracked the tension, a short bark that startled those nearest him. Then another chuckle rose from the back, then another, until the bar was alive again, but not with mockery. The sound was different now, rough, uncertain, edged with the discomfort of men forced to reassess everything they thought they knew. Damn, someone muttered under his breath, loud enough for others to hear. Alina let the noise swell without reacting. She wasn't here to win their favor, but she knew what had shifted. The room had witnessed something no amount of leather vests, tattoos, or roaring engines could deny. The woman they had laughed at, dismissed, baited into a fight, had not just survived. She had commanded. Rook pushed himself off the wall slowly, as though every muscle fought against the act. He stood, blood on his lip, pride shattered, but posture intact. He glared at her, but his silence said what words couldn't. He wasn't ready to challenge her again, not tonight, maybe not ever. The crowd parted for Alina as she stepped back, toward the center of the room. No one blocked her path. No one tested her. The circle that had once been a trap had become a boundary she controlled. The silence wasn't gone, it lingered, beneath the nervous laughter, beneath the murmurs. It wasn't the silence of expectation anymore. It was the silence of realization. And in that quiet, Alina stood unshaken, her presence filling every inch of the bar. The storm had passed, and she was the one left standing in its calm. The door swung open with a long, tired creak, and the cold night air rushed in as Alina stepped past the threshold. Behind her, the bar still hummed with low voices, the kind of restless murmurs that follow a storm. Some men laughed to cover their unease. Others sat hunched over their drinks, trying to process what they had just witnessed. But not one of them followed her. The fight was over, and she had ended it on her terms. Outside, the parking lot was a patchwork of shadows and silvered light. Neon spilled through the dusty windows, glowing across the chrome of motorcycles, lined in rows like soldiers, waiting for command. The engines were quiet, but they seemed to carry the weight of the men inside, looking silent. Still, Elena's boots crunched against gravel as she walked. The night smelled of oil, rubber, and pine carried down from the dark ridge behind the bar. A thin crescent moon cut across the sky, and for the first time in hours, her shoulders eased. She rolled them back, stretching the stiffness from the fight, letting the bruises announce themselves. Her ribs ached where his fists had landed, and her forearm throbbed from holding him pinned. Pain was expected. It was part of the language. She had spoken since she was old enough to fight back. She reached the edge of the lot and stopped. A single bike leaned apart from the rest. Smaller, less polished, its paint faded, its seat patched with tape. It was hers. She rested her hand on the handlebars, the cool metal grounding her. She didn't climb on right away. Instead, she turned back through the glass. She could still see them, the men who had mocked her, laughed at her entrance, jeered at her presence. Now they sat in clusters, voices lowered, glances darting toward the wall, where their leader had been pinned like a mounted trophy. Rook himself had vanished into the back, but she knew his silence would speak louder than any threat he could issue. He would have to live with what they saw, not just his defeat, but the ease with which she had delivered it. The bar door opened again, hinges groaning. A younger man in a leather vest stepped out, cigarette tucked between his lips, lighter in hand. He froze when he saw her still there. For a moment, their eyes met. He didn't sneer. He didn't smirk. He only nodded just once, before turning away, flicking his lighter, and disappearing into the shadows at the far end of the lot. It wasn't respect, not exactly, but it wasn't ridicule either. It was acknowledgement. Alina slid onto her bike, the worn leather seat creaking beneath her. She kicked the starter, and the engine coughed to life. The sound rough but steady. It echoed across the empty road ahead, cutting through the quiet of the night. She tightened her grip on the handlebars, the vibration rattling through her bones, steadying her. The road stretched into darkness, no lights but the faint glow of her headlamp. She didn't look back again. The bar would remember her whether she returned or not. The men inside would tell and retell the story, each adding their own twist, but the truth would remain. They laughed when she walked in. They fell silent when she walked out. She revved the throttle once, the sound tearing across the lot like a final statement, and then she rolled forward. Gravel spat under her tires as she left the bar behind, the neon shrinking in her mirrors until it was nothing but a dim buzz, swallowed by the night. The road opened, empty and waiting. She leaned into it, the wind biting against her face. her hair snapping behind her like a banner of defiance. Every mile she put between herself and that bar carried the same weight. She had walked in alone, and she had walked out unbroken. And for Alina, that was all that mattered.